All right, well, as you can see, any of you that want to ask questions during the presentation can type them over in chat. Sam will try to take a look at them as he goes or at the end. I always have to tell Sam to slow down because he's such a strong speaker and he has so much to say. He's always racing through it, but I think you're really going to enjoy the recording and the information here. All right, it's 1:35. This is Sue Bola with the Serious Games Association. As many of you know, we do these webinars as a preview to our annual conference, which this year is going to be at Carnegie Mellon University in July 21 to 23. If any of you can join us, I hope you will. We will also try to post the slides from that conference, and we are looking into recording, although the cost of recording has been out of sight for us so far. But this is just one example of the fine material. You can also look at the other speakers on our site, and I hope many of you can join us. And with that, I'm going to switch to the next slide, and I'm going to let Sam take it away.
Hello, everybody. I want to acknowledge that this is a re-recording of this event. I had some audio problems the last time I did this, and so Sue and I wanted to do this again so that everybody who attended, we had a good turnout the last event, and we wanted to make sure that they got a full event. This presentation is based on data that we will release at the conference whenever Sue decides to release it, but she'll have it before the conference. But it'll coincide, this white paper, free white paper, will coincide with the launch of the event in Pittsburgh. I'm Sam Adkins. I'm the Chief Research Officer of Ambient Insight. And here's just this is one of my favorite photographs. I don't like to be photographed for the most part, but this is a photograph when my co-founder and I were in Dubai last year. What I'm going to go over today is I'll show you how we categorize learning technology products, and then I will talk about the difference between simulation-based learning and game-based learning. I will briefly touch on the worldwide simulation-based learning market, but then relatively quickly get into the worldwide game-based learning revenues and the buying behavior in different regions, different customers. And then I'll take a deep dive into the US game-based learning revenues. And then finally, I'll close up a presentation with showing you how mobile basically is driving the edu-game market everywhere on the planet. We co-founded, we were all ex-Microsoft people. There were 5 of us in the beginning, and we were in a group called Advanced Knowledge Engineering, and we built the first commercial online learning business. So Tyson Greer, my co-founder, and I are co-owners. Tyson has retired in the last couple months. Basically, we have 2 types of products. We sell syndicated reports, and we do custom research for suppliers. They're looking for something special, you know, perhaps in a particular country or a particular product type that they're considering diversifying. So we learn a lot on the custom projects. So we've been really grateful or fortunate enough to work with some of the biggest global names, and we've got a breathtaking, I like to say, a breathtaking view of the market. I will say that we do not endorse or evaluate products. So you'll never hear us in the press or in our reports endorse a product. Now, our taxonomy is online, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of, I can talk on this slide for the
Sam? Sam, have we lost the recording?
You hear me, Sue?
Yes, I can hear you now.
That's weird. I use wireless broadband. So basically, it's like the bars on your phone. So I can get to the, I looked at my audio settings and I can dial in, Sue, if that becomes necessary.
Okay. You have the number?
Um,
All right.
it's on the interface when I click that button.
Okay. All right. So just keep going and I'll let you know if we lose.
Okay. So we watch buyers in 7 international regions. This is how we categorize it. We're now tracking 116 countries. We categorize the buying segments into 6 categories. And then we have 7 types of digital learning products that we track. And we'll talk about 2 of them today. And we categorized 4 types of suppliers, people who sell retail packaged content, custom content developers, value-added services, which we won't talk a lot about today because this is not heavily focused on the telecom industry, and then native authoring tools and platforms. Now I want to show you this is the 7 learning technology types. These are the growth rates. The first thing you'll see is that simulation-based learning and game-based learning have the highest growth rates. Now, when you look at this, you have to keep in mind that these are not revenues. E-learning, self-paced e-learning, courseware, good old-fashioned online courseware generates more revenues than all of the other 6 learning technology products combined. But nevertheless, a high growth rate means that the other 2 products there are moving fast. Again, this comes from our learning taxonomy. We publish this. We update it every year. We're very transparent. We spend a lot of energy telling people how we get our numbers, our sources of data, and how we categorize buyers and products. We don't approach game-based learning as a subset of the global video game industry. We approach game-based learning as a subset of the learning technology industry. So when you try to do it from the greater global video game industry, it's a pretty daunting task, and to be honest, it becomes a rounding error considering all the billions of dollars in the video game industry across the planet. When you approach it as a subset of the learning technology market, it's much more straightforward task. And let's face it, the big game companies and the big analysts aren't particularly interested in edutainment to the degree that they're interested in the other types of games. Now this is fascinating to me, and again, I'm an analyst, but I have no idea why this is occurring in the last couple of years. But the orange bar on your far right there is the investments to learning technology companies to date. And the quarter isn't even over. We still have another week to go. And so I'm not quite sure what's going on now, but there's obviously an incredible amount of money being given or flowing into learning technology companies. Game-based learning companies have received $83.6 million so far this year. And I'll show you the amounts that were given in the previous 3 years, and this is on par. The 83.6 million is on par with the amounts that were given to in the entire year, the 2 years before. By the way, we usually publish a white paper once a year on investment patterns. Because of this tremendous activity, we're going to do this 4 times a year. So I already released a report, a white paper, free white paper for the first quarter, and I'll release another one in the second half. So that's about 2 weeks. And so because of this phenomenal growth in investment, we're going to do it 4 times this year. Okay, I just want to show you, we'll get into definitions here in a minute. We separate out simulation-based learning and game-based learning. A lot of companies don't do that, and so they lump them together, and that's how you get these very large numbers. When you separate them out, you get a lot clearer view of the actual discrete revenues. There are distinct differences between these 2 product types, and our definitions are based on Alessi and Trollope, who are still active, They were pioneers in computer-based training, and they were the saints of when I started in 1983 in computer-based training at AT&T. They were absolutely the go-to pundits. As you can see, game-based learning has a very high growth rate of 21.9%. Considering the economy and considering the global economies, the 16.8% growth rate for simulation-based learning is astonishing, but the 21.9% is I would say robust, way more than healthy. Okay, so we'll quickly get through some definitions. We define game-based learning as a knowledge transfer method that includes gameplay. And again, it contains some form of competition and a reward system, penalty system that actually functions as an assessment, a measurement tool. In the industry, we would call it an instrument. Game-based learning have explicit learning goals. And a user wins, quote unquote, if they achieve mastery of the learning objectives in the game. And sometimes I get kind of jargony, but I've been in the training and certification industry for a long time, so these phrases come naturally to me. Now, we take our definition of simulation-based learning directly from Alessi and Trollope. Originally, they defined 4 categories of simulation-based learning, and then they compressed those 4 into 2 instructional strategies. Can you hear me, Sue?
Yes.
Okay. I just got a rather threatening.
No, you're fine.
Okay. They compressed these 4 into 2 instructional strategies, which is learning about something and then learning to do something. Really straightforward. Now we still see, and Sue and I have discussed this recently, we still see a debate, if you will, or a discussion about the difference between the game-based learning and gamification. I see people using the terms interchangeably, and in our universe, because we're an analytical firm, we cannot do that. We use Sponge Lab's definition, so we're not preaching the difference between gamification, but we fundamentally believe that gamification is not game-based learning. And here's the definition from Sponge Lab, which we like a lot. Having said that, game elements now are pretty popular in legacy training products. And it's kind of disparaging for me to say bolted on, but that's literally what they are. They're additions of that's what gamification actually is adding, rewards, badges, etc. And some of the biggest names in the industry are doing that, but those aren't game-based learning products per se. There isn't very little gameplay in gamification products. Okay, I want to briefly touch on worldwide simulation-based learning revenue. I do this because there are many people, practitioners, who conflate the two, that conflate simulation and game-based learning. And that's okay, it's not a problem. I'll give you an example. When we go to healthcare-related or medical-related portals, and it says game-based learning or edu-games, 9 times out of 10, those are all simulations, and there is no gameplay. And I'll show you some examples. Now, revenues for simulation-based learning are higher than game-based learning, but it's a much more mature market. Simulation's been around a long time. At one time, I come from corporate training. At one time, simulation-based training had a bad rap because it was, part of it was true. It was considered too expensive, quite expensive at one time, particularly custom stuff. Now there are products on the market, and there are very quick ways, rapid authoring tools that can create simulations very quickly and very inexpensively. So you'll notice that the highest growth rates are in the developing regions, and the lowest growth rates, even though they're quite high, 12% in North America, Those are in the most mature markets. So the highest growth rate is in Latin America, which is 36.1%. But if you look at the numbers between the two columns, you'll see that the revenues are growing from a relatively small amount to the large amounts. Usually when you see high growth rate numbers, it usually means you're starting from a low revenue baseline. Now this is an example of a product that's particularly interesting to me as a learning expert, is that it combines two things. It's a product that teaches oil rig workers how to use the equipment, but it also teaches English, which is the language of business in the oil and gas industry across the planet. Any country that has an oil and gas industry has English as business English as the language of business. So this one is very interesting. These are avatars, and so it would be like me being one of those guys, or I could be her, I suppose, as well. And through a microphone, I would be talking to the other avatars live in this product. Very interesting company. Now this is an example, obviously, of simulation that when the device makers and the people in the life and pharmaceutical industries, when they teach people how to use these complicated devices, they're using simulation-based learning, but there's no gameplay in this. So these are beautiful, very complex, very well done simulations, training people on how to use this equipment. But again, it's a very clear difference between a game. I recommend that you look at a couple of things here. Here's again, we're going to get into mobile, but there are now some very sophisticated simulation-based learning products on the market. I think primarily because of the proliferation, if you will, of smartphones and tablets, which are becoming very powerful computing devices now. But you can get very, very complex 3D simulation-based learning products now. I highly recommend the medical ones on the left. They're very graphic, and I do warn you that some of them, these are designed for medical professionals, so just keep that in mind, you know, when you go there. And I just wanted to show you the growth rates again in a different way for simulation-based learning. Again, Latin America has the highest growth rate, but it's starting at a relatively low baseline. The growth rates are healthy and quite robust actually in Asia and Middle East as well, and Africa, again, starting from relatively low revenue bases. And that was it for simulation. I wanted to talk about it because people sometimes confuse the two or conflate the two, but I really want to talk today about game-based learning. Now this is the worldwide market. I'll get into the United States in a few minutes here. We reached 1.8 billion last year in revenues across the planet. The global growth rate is really robust at 21.9, and revenues will reach 4.9 billion by 2019. Now, growth rates tend to slow down, and we anticipate as the market matures, and we anticipate that the really high growth rates in Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa will taper off as the products gain traction or adoption increases in those regions. However, having said that, the growth rate is so high right now that you're going to see spikes in revenue probably for the next 3 to 5 years. It's a good place to be. And here's another way of looking at the growth rates for game-based learning. And as you can see, the very high growth rates in the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and Eastern Europe, those are relatively new markets for game-based learning. And then Western Europe and North America are mature markets. Now, I wanted to take some time and show you, this is a global aggregate. We watched 117 countries, and then we, it would take us years to write reports on every country. We do break out for 10 countries. We get very granular, but this is an aggregate of customer types across the planet. What we do here this year, starting this year, what I've done is, prior to this, our reports that we've given in the Serious Play conference were I had one category called pre-K through 12. And now I broke that out into preschool, primary education, and secondary education, simply because the revenues are heavily concentrated in primary education. So game-based learning is quite ubiquitous in kindergarten and grades 1 through 3, and then they start tapering off as children get into secondary education. Tertiary, what we call tertiary, is higher education and vocational. Game-based learning has a high growth rate there, but it's very recent phenomena. Until very, very recently, you wouldn't see a lot of game-based learning in higher education or tertiary. Now there's a renewed interest there, and so we're watching a lot of new announcements. A company called Toolwire is working with Arizona State University, doing some great stuff, but it's very new. Products are very new, so we're watching, and we're not quite sure where it's going to go in higher education. The colored boxes on your left point out the types of products that appeal to these categories. Basically, the consumers in the schools, they buy packaged content. The organizational buyers, government agencies, and corporations tend to buy services. They do buy apps, particularly language learning apps are purchased. Retail package apps are purchased by these agencies, but for the most part, they tend to create custom games for tourism, literacy, healthcare-related things, disease. And again, buying behavior is different in each country. So I just showed you regional revenues. They are interesting from the 30,000-foot overview, but they're what we would say are not addressable. You really have to go into the individual country, which we do. So the 7 regions, as I said, we're watching 116 countries. I'm now working on mobile learning. And I'm halfway through. I'm in Eastern Europe right now, so to speak. And so you really got to look at Africa, for instance, is an amazing place. But Africa you have to know the language. Africa has many indigenous languages, but also there's Francophone and English, Anglophone, and then there's Lusophone, which is Portuguese. So a supplier that goes into those markets really has to understand the demographics, particularly if they're building games for children. Again, I talked about this. Now the app suppliers, have recently, to be honest, through pressure from the schools, they have now made it easy for schools to do volume, what they call provisioning. It's a term we use here in the United States. It basically means getting the apps on the device. Until very, very recently, you couldn't just hand a 5th grade tablet to the next year's students because the license wouldn't permit that. So until very, very recently in the United States, teachers, ITs, they had to wipe the tablets clean every year and then load the apps from scratch, because the apps were licensed to individual students, not to the tablet. Now the vendors have come around and they have solved those problems, and now and across the planet, Whispercast, Amazon's Whispercast is available in over 50 countries in the world. Now I'm going to take a deep dive into the United States. We watch the planet, but Sue's conference, the Serious Game conference, tends to attract international audiences, but for the most part, Sue tells me that a large percentage or significant percentage of the attendees are from the U.S. So this is the first year we've gone into the U.S. for the Whitepaper. Previously, we did North America, but this time we decided to take a deep dive into the U.S. And there's our customers again, our buyers. And And as you can see, the pattern mirrors the patterns on the globe. Consumers basically are driving the edugame market. And by the way, we use the term game-based learning and edugame interchangeably. The terms, it depends on which country you're tracking. Edugame is common in some countries. Game-based learning is not that common. Sometimes they call it edutainment, sometimes educational games, but we stick with two terms, game-based learning and edugame. As you can see, consumers dominate the United States, and I'll talk a little about which apps they tend to buy. And at the end, by the way, I'll show you where we get our information. They're free analytical sites where you can actually do your own homework and get this information for yourself. Again, the revenues in the school systems are heavily concentrated in primary education, and they start tapering out in secondary education, although the growth rate in secondary is pretty good at 32. Tertiary is taking off. This is not always the case. In the United States, it was a tough, until very recently, Macmillan was the only company that had something that remotely resembled game-based learning, and that was on financial. It was a game that you played role-playing in financial, like MBA type financial classes. Now it's taking off. What's interesting to us, is finally it looks the corporations are dropping their resistance to game-based learning. And again, I'm allowed to say this because I came from corporate training and certification. There has been resistance to game-based learning. The resistance to simulation-based learning was based on cost and the time it took to develop things. The resistance to game-based learning came from, in the United States at least, came from the culture, the work culture, the corporate work culture, where you came to work, not play. And so it's been a really tough haul in the corporate market in the United States, but now there's a lot less resistance. And again, I'll get on a soapbox. I think it's primarily because we have a much younger workforce, and they're totally comfortable with the use of games in their lives. By the way, I used to be an instructional designer, so I'm allowed to say this. The resistance I saw in corporate America was more often than not, did not come from management. It usually came from the instructional designers. So I'm not sure what that was about, but I built my first game-based learning product when I worked for United Airlines. But you'll find that military agencies in particular have no problem. Medical education, we don't break out healthcare anymore. That's included in the corporate. In the United States, at least, there are nonprofit healthcare agencies, still, but the medical, what we used to call healthcare segment, we have rolled back into corporate, and we don't separate it out. Location-based learning, I'll talk about that in a second. We define that. That's mostly on mobile, and we'll talk about that. So I'll get there. We've simplified our taxonomy. We used to have a category called NGOs, but for the most part, the NGOs aren't the ones who are buying it. The NGOs are usually the ones who distribute products. Here's an example of the United States government. The State Department built this game. It's a game to teach English, and it's used across the planet. The consulates, if you will, in every country in the world distribute this game in particular countries. So basically, it's the diplomats who are spreading this, and it's a cute little game to teach English. All right, now we're going to get into mobile. So we like to say it's kind of cliche, but all roads lead to mobile, and I'll show you why we say that. Now, if you look at the revenues for mobile edugames versus non-mobile games, PC, web, console edugames, you'll see that the growth rate for mobile is quite high at 20 and 20.3%. But the growth rate for I guess, legacy traditional games is quite steep decline at negative 12.5. Now, there's a couple reasons for this. One reason for the decline is simply because of the proliferation of mobile devices. Very powerful, very fast. And if anything, a tablet and a smartphone is a great delivery device for edu games. It's convenient, it's personal, and so to some degree that decline is due to the immense popularity of mobile devices. On the other hand, and not to go into history here, but we had a thriving edutainment business in the 90s. And this is when we had gaming arcades, and then we had the so-called multimedia, and then this console that's been around a long time, but the console industry took off. What happened is we had these great games that were on DVDs and on multimedia, but a lot of those games were never translated or were never taken to consoles, simply because they, compared to the revenues that a console game could generate, the game developers, the major game developers and the console developers weren't not particularly interested in edu games. Having said that, Nintendo has always been committed to educational games and has brought some of their most popular edu games to their console devices. So, and Microsoft works with PBS and Sesame Street. And they have edu games for the Kinect device too. So there are some, but so part of the demise of legacy edu games is the lack of product, and simply, again, I'll quit preaching, but simply the popularity of mobile games. And the revenues you'll notice for mobile edu games far outpace, and have for many years, well, 3 years, far outpace the revenues generated from legacy delivery platforms. I don't mean that the term legacy in a pejorative term. I'm just saying relative to mobile. Now, in our taxonomy, I want to get to these things to show you how we further break down mobile edu games. We have 6 types, and when we do forecast revenues for these. So we have a report online now for North America that breaks out the revenues for each of these for Canada and the United States. The definitions are relatively straightforward. It can be found in our taxonomy. Brain trainers are really new. Nintendo, again, pioneered them in 2005, 2006. At one time in the UK, Brain Age, mobile brain trainer for the DS device, Brain Age outsold, was the top selling video game for 23 weeks. Outselling any other game, console or otherwise. So brain trainers, and then Nintendo's been dropping off. Brain Age is, 40 million copies have been sold, so it's not like they're not still successful. But brain trainers on the Nintendo were the only game in town at one time. Now what's happened is you have the major vendors, Lumosity, Vivity Labs, which is Rosetta just bought. They're taking them mobile on the smartphone, basically, and they're putting them in the app stores. So these aren't, cartridges anymore, and those are popular in almost every country of the world, and I'll get to that in a second. Language learning games, mostly for young children. Some of them for teaching foreign languages, but mostly for teaching their native language when kids. So that basically this could be called it's not literacy per se, but it's teaching very young children how to speak their own languages. Location-based learning is very new and primarily used in museums, tourist attractions. And then augmented reality games emerged in 2010, which is relatively new as well, or really new. But they took off when they first arrived, and then they diminished. They petered out, and now are coming back very strongly. I just saw a headline about what's the entertainment event happening now, Sue? E3 or something?
E3.
Yeah, E3. I just saw a headline today that it said, "quote unquote," virtual reality dominates E3. And I'll show you some examples of some of the new devices. For the most part, as again, the buying behavior is different in every country. But there are some patterns that emerge, global patterns. Early childhood learning edugames, language learning apps, and brain trainers consistently rank in the top 20. And again, as I mentioned, I'll show you where we get this information so you can get it yourself. Almost all learning apps designed for young children are game-based or have some elements of gameplay. The language learning apps are dominated so far by English, although languages like Chinese are taking off as well. And it all depends on the country you're at. So if you're in a country, a Francophone country, for instance, in Africa, English would be the top language. If you're in a country, a Portuguese-speaking country, you will find both English and French. It's interesting that we like to say that English is the language of business, but when you get to South America, Brazil is Portuguese, and in Brazil, it's far more likely for buyers in Brazil to buy Spanish language apps than English, as popular as English is. But the language of business in Latin America is Spanish, except for Brazil. I wanted to point this out. This is a tremendously successful company in Sweden called Tokaboka. They are found now. They're in the top 20 in almost every country we've looked at so far this year. And the reason I show you them is to see, you can go look at their product and see what a very successful, incredibly successful product consists of. They're really new companies, launched in 2011, and they've had 85 million downloads as of April 2015. Again, they're very highly rated as far as rankings across the planet. Now, I mentioned we had a report on the North America mobile game-based market, and you'll notice here, and I'll give you some evidence, you'll notice the very high growth rates for location-based and augmented. Again, these are not revenues. So you'll find that most of the revenues are concentrated in the first four with relatively low growth rates, but location-based learning and augmented are coming on strong. And we have faith, again, in we're bullish, if you will. It's an American term for we're strong supporters of, or we think augmented has finally reached a tipping point where it'll take off. Now, this is a rather overcomplicated slide, but how location-based learning works. You'll notice that there are markers and anchors. There are many ways that museums and tourist attractions, they can, an anchor would be a chip that's embedded, literally embedded in an object. A marker would be something like a QR code, but also GPS is used. And I noticed, and I want to show you at the bottom, I put a text box there that really doesn't belong there in any particular way, but Apple just entered the market, and they bought one of the biggest augmented reality platforms in May 2015, last month, basically. I'm sure anybody that watches the news or watches the headlines or technology news, these devices and this technology is rolling out at a very, very rapid rate now. So incredible things. One thing these devices do really well, and of course we all know they'll be used for shooters and the most popular games, Mario, I'm sure, but one thing these things are very well suited for is education and training. So we're already seeing the vendors, the major vendors of these devices actively promote the use of these devices for education. Now I'm going to show you a couple examples of location-triggered augmentation. The one on the left is actually at a retail site. So basically what it's doing, it's a game for children, but what it's really doing is selling the product, right? But it's built on Qualcomm's platform. And if you go to Qualcomm's Vuforia site, they have 90 educational apps, and it'll give you some idea of incredible things you can do with that platform. And they have a 3D extension, and a couple months ago, they announced that they now support quote-unquote digital eyewear. So, I mean, when Qualcomm and Unity unite, it looks like location-based stuff time has come. By the way, the game is blatantly designed to sell product in a retail environment, but the kid doesn't know that. Parents obviously would figure it out. This is an extraordinary app on the right. It's not instructional per se, although I can make a case that it's actually a tour guide. There's this aquarium in Tokyo that's notoriously hard to find. If anybody's been, Sue and I have discussed this, if anybody has been in Tokyo, often there are no street signs, no street numbers on buildings, so it's quite difficult to find things sometimes in Tokyo. So what this company did, what this tourist site did, is based on your GPS, they built this augmented reality app, really simple, but penguins, when you get off the subway, penguins walk in front of you and lead you to the aquarium. It's actually so simple and so innovative. It's astonishing. It's cute too. Again, if anybody's watching the news, and I'm sure E3 will have a slew of these new ones come out today, but these things used to be very clunky. Some of them still are. I still, not to criticize it, but I think Oculus is still too big. Although Oculus, which is owned by Facebook, has said recently that within a few years they'll have the size dramatically reduced. So I strongly advise, and again I'm biased, I worked for Microsoft for 8 years, but the engineer who built Kinect, Microsoft acquired that technology and took the lead engineer. The engineer who built Kinect built HoloLens, and the demos of HoloLens are just extraordinary. I'll say this, here's an example of some of the catalysts for game-based learning. Investment, we consider investment as a leading indicator. Private equity firms and venture capital firms are not altruists, they're not in it they expect a return on investment. And when you see increased activity in investment, they expect to get a return on their investment in what they call the horizon, which is 3 to 5 years. So if they're bullish on this and they are supporting this, then they expect them to get their money back. So in 2013, there was 85.1 million given to game-based learning companies across the planet. These are global numbers, by the way. And then last year, 106.3 million went. And again, this, I'm not quite sure. I mean, we're only halfway through the year, but 83.6 million so far this year. So something's in the water. And if you look at the startups that are coming on the market, Educame startups, this is I recommend you look at AngelList, and you can see the kind of companies on many categories, not just education. But you'll see that the number of startups, Educame startups, has dramatically increased in the last year alone. And when you see the big players, the major players into the game, they rarely, like big companies, Microsoft included, they don't like to create markets. They like to enter a market once it's mature and there are solid revenues. I tried to get products launched in Microsoft dozens of times until I could prove that there was already an existing market and that we could make $100 million in the first year. They weren't interested at all. So Rosetta Stone has jumped into the Educame business starting in September 2013, and they claim the second app, the Arcade Academy, is the first gamified app for adults. Harcourt HMH, because those 3 words are hard to say at one time, acquired Curiosityville last year. Curiosityville is a virtual world, and soon I'll discuss this. In a virtual world, the environment is simulated, but the games that children play in it are edu games. So that's an example of kind of like the Russian dolls, the container. The container is a simulation. If anybody's seen things like Yville, which is a site primarily for teaching math to young girls, and sites like Penguins that Disney bought, once you get in there, sure, there's virtual currency, and sure you can do mindless things that kids love to do, but the games are actually game-based learning. The educational components are game-based learning. Okay, brain trainers. You know, brain trainers were very, very popular. They originally designed by Nintendo to attract, and they did successfully, phenomenally well at doing this. They were designed to attract a new demographic to gaming, and that was the older population. So the original marketing and even deployments, you know, were made to older adults, and they were very successful in establishing brain trainers and in creating a new demographic for games. They have since, you know, somewhat less successful. They have new games on Nintendo brain trainers, and they're still successful in Japan. But for the most part, their handheld DS and DS 3D brain trainers have tapered off. But they've just announced that they're going to be creating games for smartphones starting next year. Of course, they deny that and then leak it to the press. So we'll see. Lumos Labs has garnered 67.4 million since they started in 2008, and it's consistently in the top 10 and the top 20 in almost every country we look at. And if you look at the bottom box, again, I'm going through each of these countries one by one, and I'll show you how I do it. In 97 of the 116 countries we watch, brain trainers consistently rank in the top. Nintendo invented brain trainers, Sue.
Mm-hmm.
Berlin. There are plenty of games for technical education. A lot of times, technical education is, for instance, when you go into the vocational training markets across the planet, technical education tends to be hands-on. So they'll bring you in the classroom and teach you to code. There are new edu-games to teach children how to code and things like that. But for the most part, once you start, you know, being trained as a developer, for instance, or how to use a software or hardware, those are usually brought into the classroom, and there's very few edu-games at that point. It's basically hands-on, and it's practice, hands-on practice. Thank you, Sue, for doing that. Now the new companies continue to come in the market. There's a new company in Germany called NeuroNation. They are also consistently ranked in the top 20 apps in every country of the world, or at least 97 of them. Again, Rosetta entering the market. They took Vivity Labs, acquired them for 12 million. And so when Rosetta Stone has been actively diversifying into different types of products besides language, they're also into literacy products now for young children. When Rosetta enters the market, you know that there's money on the table. There's another German company called Memorado that's very popular across the planet. These numbers may sound small as far as the investment, but if you notice, these are very, very new patterns. And an English company called Peak is very popular across the planet as well. There's two things I want to get across here: that there's money going to brain trainer companies, and that they are popular almost everywhere. Now, these are examples of my co-founder who, as I said, retired recently. She wanted to travel and spend time with her grandchildren and devote her. She's already a fanatic gardener, but she wanted to spend more time in her garden. But her and her husband just got back from China, and they took the photos on the left in Xi'an. It's where the Terracotta Warriors are. And so basically you point your mobile phone at the trigger, and then the one on the far left, unanimated Terracotta, no longer Terracotta Warrior, comes out of the kind of weird, comes out of the hole there, out from the surface. And then on the smaller graphic, basically you have sculpture that actually pivots, and different sculptures pivot when you point your camera at the display. The one on the far right, Tyson took in London, and it was a game for children. So basically the kid points a smartphone or a tablet at displays, and they're playing a game as they travel through the exhibits. You'll find location-based learning heavily localized or heavily concentrated in the tourism, exhibition, galleries, and believe it or not, in recreational parks, aquariums. There's a thriving business for it as well as far as custom services. I want to take a minute and tell you how we get our stuff. There are plenty, and we use over 20 different sites across the planet that track private investment. So it depends on which country you're in, or it depends on which region you're in. Crunchbase is really good, and so is VentureBeat. Crunchbase is probably the best as far as global, but you really have to go into a region or a country and then get the investment patterns. Again, we use, and they're all public and they're all free. We use over 20 of these across the planet. And the value of this is that you watch this every day, and you can go, they have categories for education, is you can see who's getting the money. You can see where the money's flowing to, and you know what investors are interested in. One of our most valued resources is App Annie. You can go into any country in the world. If there's an Apple store in that country, you can get the top selling educational apps for that country. You can get the top grossing, which is what we're most interested in, the top paid for that week, and then the top free. Almost always, it actually surprises when it's not number one. The number one free downloaded educational app in almost every country is Apple's iTunes U. But this will give you an idea what's selling in each individual country. And then so if you intend to enter the market in China or South Korea or Brazil, you can get a really, really good idea that App Annie does the top 100, and you can see what sells and what makes money in those countries. There are not a lot of games for vocational training. Vocational, you'll find a lot of funding, particularly in China, going to increase vocational training. Vocational, I saw the word occupational. Vocational, with the exception of maybe hospitality and tourism, you'll find some games, but for the most part, vocational is by definition hands-on. You're brought in to learn how to use a lathe, or how to repair a computer, how to operate equipment, particularly in developing economies. You don't see, I don't. I'm not saying they're out there, but they're not out there in a sufficient number to be a revenue opportunity for suppliers. Sue, I think I'm at the end there. Sue?
Yes, I'm here. I was just typing that Pearson was looking into doing games for nursing and other trade trainings. I think they actually have a game in car driving, learning car operation or driving. So I think Pearson is looking into some of the vocational areas.
Well, there are very sophisticated simulation-based trainings, simulation products that teach like truck driving. They're like flight simulators. You will see test prep for license, right? You see that a lot, particularly in weird places like, pardon the expression, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK. Some of the top selling apps will be test preps apps to get your driver's license or your motorcycle license. But
okay.
I don't see a great deal of vocational. I use the term tertiary to combine vocational and higher education. You're much more likely to find edugames in higher education than you are in vocational. I can't think of I'll take your word for it, Sue, and I'll look it up on the Pearson thing, but I can't think of a single example until I find yours.
That may be simulation, so that was a good correction. We have a few more minutes, and there was a gentleman from Pakistan that was interested in asking a couple of questions. Why don't you go ahead? Or does anyone have any further questions that you would like to ask before we close down here? As I mentioned, this session is a pre-conference session before the annual conference, Serious Play Conference, which is held this year in Pittsburgh in July. We hope some of you might be able to join us, or we will also post the slide presentations from our conference after that. We also have an awards program, so if any of you are developing games, it's closed for this year, but that's another opportunity to get some visibility for your games. All right, Sam, it looks like we don't have any more questions. Thank you very much for your presentation. And someone would like to see the very last slide again. Probably not the question slide, but the one after that.
This one?
Yeah.